Welcome to Unsilent with your hosts Dave and Brian. This is not another current events podcast. We're digging deeper, diagnosing, and discussing what's really going on today, how we got here, and providing observations for future generations.
Welcome to Unsilent. We're Brian and Dave. So we hope you let us know where you think we got it right and where we botched it, and you could do that by visiting unsilentpodcast.com or any of our social channels. So let's get into it. I think today I'm going to start off with a topic. Is that okay with you, Brian?
What are you doing here? What's going on? Like this is spontaneity. We don't do that.
We're gonna do an unplanned, unscripted, like we always do.
Unscripted, unsilent. All right, I got you.
Yeah, unplanned, unsilent, unscripted. That's the way we do it.
Lay it on me. What you got, brother?
So, I've been thinking about, we got some weird stuff happening in the United States, well, in the world today.
Yeah.
And right now, one of the things that's happening, contextually speaking, is the attempt to keep President Trump off the ballot, and the corresponding reaction by other people on the opposite side who say, well, you keep him off, we're going to keep Biden off the ballot. And then you'll have blue states with one set of ballots and red states with another set of ballots, which in my estimation is a prelude to a complete societal breakup, because once you start messing with the most fundamental thing, which is voting for the president, you don't really have a culture anymore. So what leads then to a societal breakup of this nature, where there can't even be a potential agreement on what qualifies somebody to be on the ballot?
Well, first thing is, if I could answer this question with any level of authority, I would be a billionaire and I would not be doing this podcast probably today.
Yes, right.
So that's the first thing. I would own a Caribbean island somewhere if I had the wherewithal to figure all this stuff out. But I'll take my best guess at it. And it kind of, for me, goes back to, a few weeks ago, when I was in your office, we were talking about Abraham Lincoln and how he basically violated the law during the Civil War. He paused habeas corpus, which is a cornerstone of our entire governmental system, certainly the legal system. And he basically paused that. And you and I both kind of said, yeah, well, that's what he did. But we really like Abraham Lincoln a lot, and we like the outcome he got. So, yeah, we're okay with that. And he essentially broke the law. Now, I don't know if I would say that what he did is better or worse. I would say it's on par with what we're seeing now. Like habeas corpus is a truly fundamental part of our legal system, as is a citizen's right to cast their vote, to pick the delegates that choose the president, is a fundamental right of ours. I would say they're pretty equal. And so I've been thinking about this a lot the last few weeks, because I left that episode kind of not feeling great about what you and I came up with, which was we're okay with people breaking the law when it has an outcome we like, as in Abraham Lincoln's case, but we absolutely are vehemently opposed to the outcomes we don't like, which is what we're seeing now. And it keeps, for me, coming back, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, and I apologize for that, but I think it's accurate, which is values trump the law, values trump the legalities, values trump the legal structure and the structure that created the country. So, you have this agreed upon set of values, and then the law facilitates that. And we're quibbling over the law, but once the law we're no longer able to quibble over that, then we're going to be forced to reconcile the differences of our values. And that's where, again, my opinion is, I'm not educated on this stuff. I'm just a layman trying to figure this out like everybody else. But my belief is, when it comes to things like values or many things, there's only 4 ways to come to agreement. 1, you start with agreement. 2, one party convinces the other. 3, one party tricks the other. And 4, one party forces the other.
Right.
I don't know of any alternatives. And I think those are the 4 choices we will have. And we don't have agreement out of the gate. So that one's out.
Right.
I see less and less ability or interest in one party convincing the other, like through regular salesmanship or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
That one seems less and less likely. And we are seeing, I believe, large scale trickery happening just with simple things with what does democracy mean now? And when we say we're going to protect the whatever, what's the phrase they're using, like to protect the sanctity of our democracy. Well, we don't even agree on what that means anymore. So that's trickery. Yeah. Now we're using words we know the other people don't believe the same thing as we do. Or we're saying things like Donald Trump shouldn't be on the ballot because he was in the insurrection. Well, that's BS. He's not been convicted of an insurrection, and it's arguably it wasn't even an insurrection to begin with. Whatever. Again, so now we're into the trickery mode, and when that one fails, and the law is not able to force us to come together and maintain the values we started with, there's only one option left, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it's brutal, and it's happened over and over. There's sometimes people will argue about this idea of ethics and values and morality and law, and they'll say something to the effect of, you can't legislate morality. But in reality about morality, that's kind of cool. In reality about morality, law is nothing more than shared values being legislated, being codified, being put on paper. And so therefore, I don't remember, I should know this off the top of my head, but one of the founders said the Constitution is meant for a moral people. It's meant for and if you don't have a shared morality, if there are two competing moralities, then what ends up happening is, as in the case that I was bringing up, what you have is both sides saying the law is an outcome of the correct morality, which happens to be my morality. And so if you've got two different, that most fundamental disagreement on values is what ultimately ends up breaking apart a nation. And it's happened before. And I think the application, we'll all be long dead by the time that Kenny G comes around. But I think the application in his day will in some way be similar to this values discussion that we're having right now. If there's two sets of competing values that are irreconcilable, then how do you keep a nation together? How do you keep it from falling apart completely?
Well, my opinion for since really the summer of 2020, my opinion has been there's only really 3-ish possible ways to do what you're describing. One is like this idea of civil war. And again, I don't mean like, trenches and muskets, although I'm not ruling that out. But when I say civil war, it doesn't have to be that. It could be an economic war. It could be lots of different things. It could be a trade war between states. And I won't give you agriculture and I won't give you Netflix. I don't know. Who knows what it could be, right? It doesn't have to be muskets and trenches is my point. But civil war is certainly one option. Another option is just like happened in World War II, where people, because of the magnitude of us fighting the Germans and us fighting the Japanese, it's not even really remembered or talked about. But there wasn't that much. There was a very similar period in the 30s, especially, but the 20s leading up to that, where, and especially after the Great Depression, after the crash of 29, where this argument between free markets and communism was very, very strong. And people were afraid that FDR was going to basically bring in communism. And that's completely been lost because of the magnitude of World War II. So what happened then is this argument that we're seeing now, to some extent, I can't say if it was the same or less or more than what we're feeling now, but was preempted by an outside force attacking Pearl Harbor. So an outside force threatening the sovereignty, the safety, the whatever of the country, forced everyone to come together right now. So that's the second option, is some kind of outside force comes in and unites us, because that outside force, our disagreement with them is much, much greater than our disagreement with each other. So that's the second option. The third option is the government becomes so corrupt, so bastardized, so not functional, so cynical and tyrannical that the people unite against the government. And I think that those are the three most likely outcomes. And again, I don't necessarily mean it has to be like, guns and airplane battle, but history has shown us that is typically how it's done.
And in each one of those, there's an alignment of values that takes place.
Yes.
So in the one where, for instance, an outside force comes in, we go to war with China or something like that.
Yep.
The shared values return, because the shared values are at that point not having to do with anything we're talking about now, but are we going to live or are we going to die? Is our country going to live or are we going to die? And we want to live, even if it means living with those so-and-sos that we really don't like next door.
Yeah.
Or it becomes a shared value that is enforced upon us by a tyranny. That becomes a shared value in that scenario. So
that
in
our
every case,
freedom, our individual freedoms we value that more than we value adherence to this regime.
Right. Or in the real, in the one where tyranny ultimately wins out, like in Germany, it still came down to, we value our Germanness and we let somebody else define that Germanness in nefarious and evil ways. But we value our Germanness. And so therefore they follow along something that would have that value of your national identity, if you want to call it that, accelerates beyond other values that you hold closely, that you've held dearly from before then. So,
and in all three of those cases, one of the things that I think snaps, I imagine it's like a rubber band. And you and I have talked about the difference in the guys who were 21 years old or 28 years old in 1946 who had served in World War II in either theater, doesn't matter.
Right.
They had a sense of duty.
Right.
And then you look at 21 to 28-year-olds now, they have a sense of entitlement. And I think that that's like a rubber band that gets stretched and stretched and stretched. And in any one of those scenarios that I laid out as being seemingly likely scenarios, that rubber band will snap immediately, because people will no longer be judged on their intention, and they won't be judged on how they get to be morally superior by saying the right things. Overnight, it will matter, what can you do to actually affect a positive impact or outcome for the cause? Not in an abstract, you mean well, and you're the Dylan Mulvaney dancing around and displaying these values, but what can you do to protect your platoon? Like overnight, it will change, and we will be right back to, or rapidly moving back to, the sense of duty required to take care of those around you. And I think that is going to be an interesting thing to watch, again, to see if my kind of hypothesis, for lack of a better word, I have nothing to base this off of other than my interpretation of history and what I'm seeing now. But to see if it is like that rubber band effect, where overnight, whether we're at war with China, we're at war with the tyrannical government that AI has taken over, or whatever it is, or even in a civil war situation, it will matter way more what you do than what your intentions are.
So what you're saying then is ultimately that fear and pain cause a societal reset.
Yeah.
A societal reset of values. So it's not even, so that rubber band is not a conscious thing that society does. It's a natural reaction to the fear of extinction or the pain that we're going through in that particular time that brings us back to reality. Sort of it's almost a self-correcting mechanism built into the fabric of society that causes this to happen. I kind of
look at it like, imagine a object in the middle and a bunch of rings around it, and kind of like who is it that has the hierarchy of needs? That Pavlov or
Maslow.
Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So I kind of imagine like that, where the values are the thing at the center, and then maybe the law is the first ring out, and then maybe social decorum is the next ring out. Or I've not thought this through, so I have no idea what the 7 and 9 rings are, or how many. There might be 3, there might be 12. I don't know, but I kind of imagine like we kind of have gone through this expansion on these rings, but now we're retreating back, and we'll be retreated back to all we can defend is our values. And what will tell us if I'm going down, I'm going down defending what I think was right, which trumps the law. It trumps social decorum. It trumps all these other things that we've been kind of bickering about for the last 40 years, 30 years, 20 years. I kind of imagine it like that. Like people get forced into a corner where it's fight, freeze, or flight. It's I kind of imagine it like that, but the values are what is the last post they'll defend, I think.
Right. Because, and I think it has to do with that cycle of success leading to excess.
Yeah,
So
100%.
we can afford to argue about this and that and the other thing that
Exactly.
our
Afford is the
ancestors.
right word.
Yeah,
100%.
we can afford to do it because we've got so much protecting leeway,
Yep.
between fundamental survival and
Yep.
where we're at today. But then that
Yeah.
shrinks and that shrinks and that shrinks. And of course, the problem with this is that it shrinks into places that we've never experienced before in our lifetime. Our ancestors have. So they understand it. The people who went through World War II have. The people who went through the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, they experienced the reduction of their margins, if you will, between survival and the aspirations you have. Well, we want everybody to get along. We want nobody to be offended, and all. Well, eventually, it's like, no, we just need to eat. That's all. We just need to eat. We just need to have shelter over our heads, and we don't want to be shot. That's all.
Yeah.
That retracts it again.
Dave, I got an IT problem here. I need you to continue that thought for 30 seconds. I got to plug a wire into my computer, so I'll be right back.
Well, continue that. Well, and so we do see that. Interestingly, we see that in other societies as well. If we look at what happened in World War II, or World War I, rather, if we take a look at the powers that ultimately went to war in World War I, they weren't the powers that started the war. So for Germany and for Russia, for instance, the two of the big antagonists in that war, they had the leeway to say, yes, we're supporting these people over here. We're supporting the Serbians. We're supporting the Austro-Hungarians. And it's no skin off our nose to support that. But what it ultimately came down to was an expansion of hostilities that destroyed those empires. They didn't realize that they didn't have the leeway they thought they had. The Tsar or the Kaiser, neither of them realized they didn't have the leeway to make these. In fact, all of the different, it's fascinating, all of the different intertwining treaties between the different nations that ultimately went to war over something that was really none of their business. It was just out there in a hinterland that most people couldn't identify. So, and that problem happens, I think, in society over and over. When you become successful, you don't realize that you're making commitments and betting the future on things that could fundamentally undermine and destroy your basic value system. It's that I love aspiration, but that kills you.
Yeah, and I think a thought I've been having over the last couple of days. Again, you and I don't do like show prep. We don't rehearse what we're going to talk about, but I do like kick around. That's true. We did a solid 38 seconds today for sure. But I do kick around ideas as I'm out walking and things like that, or in the shower. I kick around ideas, like thoughts to prepare myself for this.
Right.
You and I don't do like show prep. Again, my reason for doing this is I don't want to be the person who lived, the equivalent of the person who lived 5 miles from Auschwitz and didn't say anything as, millions of people were being gassed. Like I would, my values would not allow me to do that. That's 100% values driven. And so thinking about, again, just always ask myself, how could that have happened in that situation? How could it have happened in World War II? How could it have happened in the Revolutionary War? I mean, if you're British, like the Revolutionary War was not a great outcome, and it was the same cycle we see now. And I keep coming back to this kind of. I agree with everything you just said about all these things end up like they don't matter, and boom, all of a sudden one day they matter. And how could that be? And part of what I've come to the conclusion is, in the defense of the gal who lived 5 miles from Auschwitz, I think so poorly of, because her husband was sent off to war and she was there quietly making her bread every day and whatever, like nothing was going on. Our entire lives we're surrounded by people who are full of shit. Like everyone is always telling us they're going to go on a diet and they're going to build a race car and they're going to fix up their house and they're going to build a business and they're going to like do all these grand things. And 87% of the time, they're just full of crap. Like it's just those things just never happen, right?
Right.
So our entire lives were conditioned for people to say these grand things, and it just never really happens. Right. So if you spent your whole life getting worked up every time somebody said they were going to overthrow the government or they were going to keep a presidential candidate off the ballot or whatever, you would have wasted a life defending things that are just never going to happen.
Right. Exactly.
So that's one thing. The second thing is we don't know what it's like to be in a real life situation. I think we were going to look in hindsight 5 years from now and say we were definitely in that moment in 2024 as you and I are recording this.
Sure.
But you and I do not have in our lifetimes a period of time where we can say that bad things, like really, really awful bad things happen, and nobody was there to legitimately like look out and stop it.
Right.
So that's the second thing is our entire lives, somebody that we'll never know who it was, we'll never know their name. They had the 17th cubicle on the 3rd floor of the Pentagon. Somebody somewhere like said, whoa, we can't do that. Or somebody in some political office said, whoa, timeout. Okay, we can't go that far. We can't do that.
Right.
And we've been conditioned that somebody somewhere that we don't know is a fail-safe, and it's not upon us. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not saying it's fair or unfair. I'm just saying this is what you and I have experienced, at least from my perspective in our lifetimes, is somebody somewhere is the fail-safe to prevent things from going too far. But that's been predicated on us all having the same values. And now that we don't have the same values, the person that would have pulled the fail-safe in 1988 will not pull the fail-safe now, because pulling this fail-safe would be the last thing they would do, because the fail-safe that we think of as fail-safe to them is the kryptonite to their movement.
Exactly. We believe, and it's some of it's back to this idea of normalcy bias, that this has never happened before. The government's never failed us before in this way that we're talking about right now. And people talk about they shouldn't let this happen. Who's the they, right? Who's the and we assume that the they is somebody who's smart, who's in control, who can see what's happening, who can see all the things that are happening around, and who has plans in order to counteract those things. We talked about that movie that what was it called? The one that the Obamas were involved in.
And last whatever.
Yeah, well, and the interesting thing about that, the sort of the poll line from that movie was this idea that, well, no, really nobody's in control, and the they that you think is out there is nobody. They're not there. And so I think part of the challenge of our day is having this faith that, well, it's just a storm. It'll blow over. It's always blown over in the past. It's never been a problem before. The Titanic's too big. It can't, the people that built this anticipated everything. I don't care how big that iceberg is. We'll just brush past it. It'll be okay. And you don't realize that it won't until it's too late.
That movie was Leave the World Behind. I have not seen it. So I've only heard bits and pieces about it. I don't know that I'll be, clamoring to go see that for sure. But,
sure.
But people probably listen to us talking. Probably, I rather watch that movie. Listen to you two yahoos talk about the end of the world all the time.
Yeah, that's right.
So, again, circling back to like all the things you just listed, like somebody will be smart enough, somebody will have a plan, whatever, and we always take for granted though that we will have an aligned value set.
Yes,
because that's all we've ever known. Again, that to the normalcy bias, like all we've ever known is a world where, of course, people all want a similar, not exact, but a similar version of what I was taught in 3rd grade and 7th grade as what is a free market society. People often incorrectly call what we have a democracy. It's a constitutional republic or whatever. But our version of democracy that everyone was taught in 7th grade history class, we kind of have this belief that, of course, they have a similar view. It might not be exactly the same, but of course, it's pretty close. And I think we're going to look back 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and say, no, how could we be so blind? It was our bias that had this with these rose-colored glasses on. Every single indicator, every single sign you could think of was pointing to the fact. I mean, they're actively, keeping people from voting for who they want to for president. Sure. They're actively saying that there was a New York congresswoman this week who actively said, yeah, I need more people in my district for redistricting, talking about the illegal people coming in outside the country. Like, there's no set of values that we could share that would say, okay, it's okay to have an open border to this extent. Like,
right.
There's very clear indicators that we're not on the same page. But for us to the lift for people to see that requires them giving up all those levels, those rings that you said we could afford, which was 100% accurate. They would have to sacrifice all those rings of comfort to defend the values, and they just want to live their lives. They've accomplished great things in some cases. They have money in the bank. They have college funds for their kids. They have all these things that giving all that up would be like giving up their purpose of life so far.
Well, in this goes to the notion that there is a common human, that the common values of humanity are transcendent across the globe. If you take a look at, for instance, all the protests we see about the Middle East right now, so there's this idea that, for instance, the Hamas and the people that support Hamas they just want to live their lives, and they just want to have a place to live, and they just want to have an opportunity to raise their kids. But the reality of the situation is that there's a whole group of people that have an aspiration, and not to make this about current events again, but have an aspiration to be able to die in martyrdom and to destroy another set of people. No, and if they can live, if their kids can live their lives, that's great, but it can't. But that can't take precedence over the desire that they've been taught all their lives to destroy their enemies and to wipe them out completely. Now, what do you make of that? Well, one of the things you make of that is that humanity doesn't necessarily share those same values. And in the situation with Nazi Germany, no, they can't be gassing people down the road for me. That can't. No, it's just conspiracy theories. That's not reality. Because doesn't everybody just want what I want? A good job, 3 squares, and my kids happy? I think that's the core of it.
I wouldn't. I'm sure. I'm paraphrasing for somebody who lived in 1943. I mean, again, paraphrasing for somebody who lived in 1943. I would imagine them thinking or saying to their friends or neighbors, "I wouldn't want to live around the Jews." But I certainly don't. There's no way they're gassing them. That would be too far. That would be too much.
Yeah,
I wouldn't want to be associated with them because that would reduce my social status, because they are deemed less than by whoever is in charge of determining these things. But to actually just kill them just for the sake of their ethnicity and religion, that's gross. I would imagine most people thought that. Yeah, you're right.
But so I wonder then how that will manifest in the future. So right now we talk about, I mean, if you look at what could potentially break the U.S. apart right now in this whole election thing, right? I mean, it's access to the ballot by 2 incredibly unpopular people.
Yeah.
But what happens in that situation? Nobody's going to care. Kick Biden off. Nobody likes Biden. Kick Trump off. Nobody likes Trump. They have their core supporters, but nobody likes, that would be sort of the societal way of thinking. But if you think about it back to the Civil War and take the how many people in the South actually owned slaves? It wasn't a majority. It wasn't everybody.
It was like 5% or something like that.
It's a very small percentage.
It's probably different than that. It was not very many. Yeah,
it wasn't very many. So so there's a lot of people in the South that were like, they weren't ardent slave supporters, and they
were barely getting by on their own. They could barely keep a roof over their head that didn't leak, and they had their own problems probably. Yeah.
So then why would they go to war over that? Or why would the folks in Chicago, were all the folks in Chicago who wasn't a slave state and was, and they didn't like, slavery. Oh, that's gross. But are they willing to go out and sacrifice their children for it? Well, they ended up doing that in the end. So how do you get disinterested populations, or maybe not disinterested, but folks who aren't willing to literally die on that hill? How do you get them to go to war and kill 600,000 of your fellow Americans? Yeah. At first blush,
my understanding of the Civil War, which again is based on what I learned in 7th, 8th, and 12th grade and all that kind of stuff. So I could have had a crummy teacher who gave me bad information. I don't know. My understanding is part of what motivated the people in the South, like you're talking about, who were not interested in slave anything.
Yeah.
They certainly didn't own slaves. Many of them worked alongside slaves to make money because they were, before there were sharecroppers, they were sharecroppers or whatever. And it came down to states' rights versus the federal government's rights. The South was all about preserving the states' rights. For example, Robert E. Lee, the reason he became the general for the South was he was defending the state of Virginia. Had nothing to do with the Confederate States of America. He was defending, and his army was the Virginian, whatever, First Army or whatever it was. And he was beholden. His honor was put on the line to defend the state or the Commonwealth, forgive me, of Virginia. That's it. And so the states were and the rural people were defending their way of life to live where the states had more power than the federal government, and they wouldn't be told what to do by people who lived in New York City and Baltimore and Washington and all the places where they looked down their noses on people who lived in huts with leaky cedar roofs.
And see, this is what it comes down to. This is the interesting part of it. So you tie all that up and you say it wasn't about, necessarily grand philosophical issues, but it was those people against my tribe. So yeah, I'm not 100%. Much in favor of slavery. I'm not, all of that in the South. Maybe they're saying that, but then here come the Northerners. They're coming against us. And it's the same thing with, you've got a lot of folks that if you look at President Trump, what happens every time he gets indicted on something? He's got 91 indictments or something like that. Yeah. He gets more people that are like, well, yeah, I don't really like him that much, but that's totally unfair. That's completely wrong. Or the same thing on the Biden side. Sure, he can, barely walk. He looks like he's, belongs in a nursing home, but we got to be, we have to support him because we're against these other people, these extreme people coming against us. So it turns out that the value in those situations, or in Nazi Germany, well, yeah, I don't know about, the Jews, but Germany. So it comes down to these kinds of, affiliations and tribalism that become the preeminent value. It becomes the top value. It becomes the thing I identify with more than anything else.
Yeah. And to be clear, while I'm sympathetic to the people we're describing who lived in rural parts of Mississippi and Alabama who had nothing to do with slavery and things like that, were barely eking out a living, many of them lived in ways that you and I could not even imagine the squalor they lived in. While I empathize with them, I do think Lincoln was right. And I do think it was worth everything he did. And I think that it was the only way to fulfill the destiny of the country that was set forth from the beginning, was to rectify this major, ugly, huge, amputated part of our body in this flaw. Lincoln had no choice. And when he sent Sherman through to basically just burn it to the ground, meaning the South, that's where the real animosity was just solidified again, based on my understanding of history from a guy who I promise you was no slave sympathizer. He was about as liberal as a teacher as you could have back in 1989 when I was in school or whatever. But one of the things that I always think about with Trump, which it reminds me of Lincoln, and again, I'm not a historian on the scale that you are, but there's a handful of things I've studied some, and Lincoln is one. It's been a decade since I've done any serious reading on it, but one of the things I remember about Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant. So Lincoln had gone through something like 7 or 9 generals before Grant, and each one was just a wuss, basically.
Yes, exactly.
They were just cowardly. They just had no balls. They had no gumption. And I remember a letter he wrote to the Secretary of State or something like that, basically complaining if they have 1 million troops, they would say they can't fight unless they have 2 million troops. There's always a reason they can't. And then along comes Grant, who was known as a womanizer, who was known as an alcoholic, who was known as all these things, right? For many years, he was portrayed as one of the worst presidents ever, even though I think that's a little bit unfair. But he had all these not very good character flaws, kind of like you would say about Trump. And Lincoln would time and again come back to, but he fights. And I think that is what Trump represents for people now is, He's a guy that he has all these quirks and character flaws, and he calls women pigs. And I wish he wouldn't do that. And I wish he would just get the F off Twitter, and everything would be a lot better. He would just not do that. But you know what? I don't care. He fights.
Yeah.
And he's fighting for me, and nobody else gives a shit about me. Even these people who pander to me, he's the only one who really will fight. And I will put up with his character flaws because he's protecting my values.
Well, isn't that the way it ends up with any of the tribal leaders? So, you know, whether the tribal leader is Biden on his side, who just, you know, I mean, we're in our day, we're in full election season mode now. And so, you know, we see his speeches about, you know, the as you said earlier, democracy is on the line. And, you know, if this guy wins, it's basically, he's going to become a dictator. So both sides then come up with this sort of rhetorical fighting. And eventually the problem is when that rhetorical fighting turns into physical fighting, when it degrades to the point, because you can only, you know, you can only stand nose to nose with somebody and yell at him and call him a pig and call him, you know, horrible and call him whatever for so long before they start doing the same, and it degenerates into fisticuffs, right? I mean, that's how all bar fights start. Well, I'm not an expert on bar fights. Never been in one. Never even seen one.
You've never been in a bar fight? Come on, Dave.
I've never been in a bar fight.
Hey, before you die, you can get at least one bar fight. Even if you just hide behind the guy halfway and do it, that's fine.
Maybe I'll go do an Unsilent podcast research project at the local bar down here we're done and see how that turns out.
Every man should be at least one bar fight in his life. I'm a firm believer in that.
I'll keep that. I'll put that out of my diary. So, but you know what's interesting about that is that isn't that the way that most of those situations start? They start with people getting angry with a little thing. They get angry with each other. It accelerates. And then in the end, the value is, I just got to win. I just got to win. And by any means necessary, I just got to win. That's how wars start. That's how everything ends up spiraling out of control. And so I think for Kenny G in the future, when he looks at whatever the current angst is, you know, near the end of the century, when it accelerates in terms of noise and in terms of action to an extent where, like, this could really start blowing up any day now, then you know you're on the edge of what we're on the edge of right now.
Right. Yeah. And just for people listening, like, you keep hearing us talk about Kenny G, and you're wondering, who the heck is Kenny G? Kenny G is a guy that Dave and I made up. He's a guy who's part of what is now being referred to as Generation Gamma. He'll be born around the year 2040, and he'll be middle-aged around 2090, which is about the time Dave and I expect this cycle will be coming around again. And 2090 is about when we would expect that they might be in a similar kind of situation we are now, maybe 2100. But 2090 would be a few years before he would hit it, and we're just trying to explain from our perspective what this moment is like to help Kenny G either prepare or understand, you know, just kind of what's going on, because, you know, we're using historical references that are centuries old at this point, because this only happens every 80 to 100 years. So that's who Kenny G is. That's why we say we'd love for you to tell us what your thoughts are, because we want to know legitimately, like, are we portraying what you think this moment feels like? We want to kind of chronicle this for Kenny G, and a great way to do that is to go to our Rumble page and leave a comment on the video there. It's a great way to do it. Go to Unsilent Podcast, like Dave said. But the point is, we would like to have a complete story to tell Kenny G, not just Dave and I. So if you think we're telling something that doesn't feel quite right, please jump in and tell us. So, you know, that's who Kenny G is. And I think that going back to what you were talking about, Dave, about the leaders, one of the things that I keep hearing, whether it's, you know, these buffoons on the news, you know, well, I shouldn't even say news, these buffoons on the pseudo news channels that are very partisan now. And it's this constant volley of, okay, yeah, our guy's this, I get our guy's not perfect, but their guy, look at their guy. Right. And it's this constant thing of we assess our guy on his intentions, and we assess their guy on his outcomes.
Right. Yeah.
And this is where that's all okay until the values are on the line and we are in figuratively, if not literally, in the trenches. Then I don't care about anybody's intentions.
Right.
I care about how well you can do the thing that's going to protect the guy next to you, protect our neighborhood, protect our town, protect our country, protect our value, you know, all those things. And and how much energy you're putting into expressing how righteous you are for having the right beliefs suddenly doesn't matter a whole lot anymore, I would imagine, in those situations.
Right. And I think what happens in these situations that we're in right now, we think, how could we have ever gotten to a place where brother from one state kills brother from another state?
Yeah.
It's incremental. There's one outrage leads to another outrage. So, 10 years ago, I don't think anybody would have said, whoever's running, if they get enough votes and if they get the support of the parties in their state, they can be on the ballot. We wouldn't have even considered this idea that we consider today, like, well, no, we don't like him. So, we have these reasons he shouldn't be on the ballot. And it's always possible whenever any line is crossed, whenever any door is opened, it's really hard and what's really impossible to shut that line, to shut that door, or to reinvigorate that line so people don't cross it again. And each outrage essentially leads to the next one, which leads to the next one, which leads ultimately to the one where it becomes a physical conflict.
Yeah, it becomes the shots fired on Fort Sumter, and exactly. We're off to the races, right?
Exactly right.
Again, I'll try to, hopefully you, or maybe I can figure a way to drag us into a little more positive thing after going down this road. I'm going to go down here now. One of the things you said earlier is like, I wonder what the future holds. I wonder, kind of what's in store for us. And one of the things I've been kind of sorting through is, if my thesis is correct, which is values are at the pinnacle of the hierarchy, which includes religion, but is not, sure. I would say religion fits within values, not the other way around. But I could be wrong about that. I don't know, whatever. My point is, some people see people with a theocratic desire, intention, or want to rule the world. And I don't think that's entirely accurate. I think it's more about values. And sometimes religion fits within the values. And oftentimes values are shaped from religion. So I don't question any of that part. But I don't think it's Christians are trying to take over the U.S. I think that the Christians lost that battle many years ago. But if that thesis is correct, where the values are at the pinnacle of that hierarchy of needs, so to speak, and law is maybe, a rung or two down from that, which I would think it'd probably be somewhere in that neighborhood, and the law is going to be pushed aside, well, then it opens up a measurable number of possible outcomes. Because if the Constitution is not going to be upheld or used to make decisions, or states will just go rogue and just say, well, we don't care anymore. Like, we decided that's insurrection, and so be it. So the guy's not on the ballot. If that is the path we're willing to go down, and until I see evidence to the contrary, I'll keep assuming that we are, then lots of things are on the table. An entirely new governmental structure is on the table. We could have King Obama, possibly. There's lots of things that are on the table that you and I might not even fathom, that or couldn't even imagine, because we've had this legal protection to make sure we are all adhering to the values we kind of had this unspoken agreement of. And I kind of look at the law like, I have a 1971 Chevy pickup that doesn't have a fancy security system. It has door locks. If you wanted in bad enough, you could get in. But I lock the door, and people say things like, well, it's to keep the honest people honest. And I kind of feel like that's where the law has been for the last little bit, is keeping the honest people honest. But once that's willing to go away, who knows what's in store for us. And we lost Dave. Dave's gone. Dave's MIA. Like, I don't know where he went. So I guess I'll bloviate for a minute and wait and see if he comes back. And if he does, we'll wrap things up. If not, again, one of the things we want to stress to you guys is, if you haven't had a chance yet, go to unsilentpodcast.com. You can check out our social media channels there. Really would be best, probably the easiest way to comment or chime in on what we're talking about is go to our Rumble channel. On the video, the section below the videos there's a little comment section. Be a great way for you to chime in and again, give your opinion. Tell Kenny G from your perspective what this moment in time is like for you. Tell Kenny G where you think Dave and I got it right. Tell Kenny G where you think we got it wrong. the pieces that are important that we're missing, the nuances that we're misunderstanding. We'd love to get your input on that kind of stuff. And I don't think Dave's coming back. So I guess a positive way to wrap this up is something we talked about a few weeks ago, which is it seems like things are heading in a bad direction. And the good news is, the really good news is, on the other side of whatever perhaps unpleasantries are in front of us is a renewed sense of a united set of values, like we're talking about, and just feeling like we're all in the same boat again. If you look at what happened, what the 1950s looked like, it was us against the world, and in a very positive way, not in a condescending, not in a cruel way, but there was a tremendous amount of American pride and a tremendous amount of patriotism and people knowing we had done the right thing in World War II and knowing we were doing the right thing to fight communism. And we will have that renewed sense of unity once again, once we get through whatever crisis is awaiting for us. So the good news is, from the guy who wrote the book, The Fourth Turning, Neil Howe, which I would recommend reading. I think it's a fantastic book to explain how this cycle works. Neil kind of likens it to a divorce. Like, it was horrible, and we wouldn't want to go through that again, but it was the best thing that could have happened to us. And that's kind of what that's how he explains these crises is these things had to happen. We had to get through it. And I'm so glad we did. I'm going to be have a much better life and happier life now that I've gone through that, but I wouldn't want to go through it again. So it seems like that's direction we're heading. And again, thanks for tuning in. Glad to be part of our family. And so until next time, this is Dave and Brian signing off.
See you next week.
Do you want to be Unsilent? Make your voice heard on our social media channels and share where you think we got it right or wrong. Go to unsilentpodcast.com for social links so you can join the discussion.